Well, let's talk more now about the cuts in funding to Palestinian refugees, which amounts to more than £200 million. We're joined now by James Soreen, the Chief Executive of BICOM, a Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre. Good evening to you. This isn't entirely unexpected, is it? Because back in January, President Trump halted some of the payments, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, they've been hinting about this for a while, but there's been a debate in the US for many years about what you do about this agency. And let's go back to the beginning. I mean, the agency was set up after the first Arab-Israeli war in 1948. It did an incredible job providing healthcare support and food to the Palestinian refugees, about 700,000 that left what is now Israel. And it was provided them with support. But now, 70 years later, after a lot of those refugees have been living in neighbouring Arab states, there is a question about why not more has been done to resettle them and whether it's sustainable to have the only agency in the world for one group of refugees, UNWRA, rather than any other group, and also for refugee status to be inherited kind of in perpetuity. So you have a group of refugees, probably no more than a few tens of thousands that are alive today. That's now become 5.5 million when you consider that their grandchildren and even great-grandchildren are inheriting that refugee status. So you've got to look at the budget model, you've got to look at the model of whether that's the right thing to do. And also, you've got an organisation employing something like 30 or 40,000 people in a number of countries, which is far larger than the entire staff of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which deals with refugees from all over the world. So there are a lot of questions.
Palestinians have accused the United States of being racist. We've had guests on earlier today who felt that was the way that it was, and it was an attack on their people. Would you agree?
Well, I think what the US is doing here, it is careless. There is a negligent approach here in pulling funding from an agency without perhaps working much harder since that initial announcement in January to try and actually reform UNWRA, or at least to come up with different streams of funding for Palestinian refugees. In, for instance, Jordan, you could have put together packages US to Jordan that will provide ongoing support for Palestinians and Palestinian refugees. I don't think it's racist. I think it's part of a US approach which is trying to really shake up a lot of the previous certainties around the situation for the Palestinians and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They moved the embassy to Jerusalem. They've been talking about cutting funding to UNWRA and saying it isn't sustainable, but it's also part of a wider sort of Trumpian view of the point when you look at the funding model. The US and the UK combined provided $440 million to UNWRA in 2017, whereas Saudi Arabia, UAE and Qatar, who are not short of a few dollars, provided $60 million in the same year. So there is a lot more that could be done in terms of sharing the burden, and the US have just lost patience with that.
Do you think that it is a matter for other countries to increase their funding? Because, of course, the United States has always put the most money in. President Trump has tweeted in the past saying that the Palestinians haven't been grateful for that money.
Well, I think if you're going to provide funding, whether it's through an aid agency or elsewhere, I think, there's always a question about to what extent do you use that in terms of a carrot and stick approach, in terms of what you want politically. We've had that debate here in the UK in terms of our own funding through DFID. It is dangerous territory, but there is some sympathy from people involved in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that say that, if the US is going to be providing these huge amounts of funding to the Palestinian Authority and to Palestinian refugees, they perhaps can say, well, look, if we're going to return to negotiations, at least look at our proposals. And the Palestinians have basically walked away from the table since the US announcement about Jerusalem last December. But I think one issue as well, it speaks to this Trump view of the world, which is, why should we be the ones that are paying all the money? And there is a question there for some of the other emerging powers. Look at some of those very, very wealthy Arab states. Look at what some other countries, like China and others could potentially do as well. There isn't a rule that says, the US has to be the one that writes the biggest check. But no doubt this will have very big implications in terms of tensions on the ground. There is an issue here about support ongoing for health and education, and also in some very unstable areas in the Middle East.
Of course, Germany has said that it will increase its funding. Israelis in the past have said that with this reduction in funding, it could lead to increase in extremism. It could create more marginalised societies. Are you inclined to agree with that?
Well, the Israeli reaction is fascinating because they're really caught between two sides of this debate. On the one hand, they know that if you pull the plug on the funding for Palestinian refugees, for a lot of people who are in desperate need of health and education, then that's going to cause a massive problem. You're talking about schools, you're talking about basic healthcare. You know, Israeli security officials know that if you pull the plug on that could potentially create a dangerous situation. So you've got to have something to replace it with. But they know that long term, at the same time, it creates a very big problem. UNWRA is a deeply politicized agency that is devoted to the principle of every descendant of the original Palestinian refugees being a refugee in perpetuity. So they're creating a much bigger problem as we move forward in time. And you've seen that now where you have 5.5 million people saying we want a right to return to Israel. That's clearly nonsense. It's clearly never going to happen. So it does obstruct and cause much more problems if you want to actually negotiate a solution. So Israel's caught between that. They're caught between sort of the actual political argument and the politicization of UNWRA and what it's doing perhaps for radicalization. And on the other side, they know that who else is going to basically end up providing health and education, and Israel will also be involved in filling some of those gaps alongside the EU and others.
OK, James, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for coming on this evening. Appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you.